Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL week number 9 overview and analysis video. This is the final week of the LPL regular season. Technically, it's a week, but it's really like a continuation of the end of week number 8. We've got 3 days to go over, each with 2 series apiece, so only 6 series to cover in today's video. And of course, by the end, we will know our 10 playoff teams, we will know what order they are in, and we will have kind of everything we need for the end of the regular season going into the playoffs. So I'm very excited. You know, it's not like we're going to learn a ton of new things here, but there is still stuff on the line. Most notably, a top 2 seed is on the line with one of the series later on in this episode. So I'm excited to go over that, but let me know what you think of everything going on in the LPL down in the comments section below. With the regular season coming to a close, I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions on what you think might happen going into playoffs. Who's hot? Who's not, in your opinion? Very much just kind of interested in the public consensus. Of course, if you want to know how I've been feeling about these teams going into this week, you can check out the LPL playlist. That's going to be up in the iCard right now. That's going to have every single weekly review. It's not required viewing or anything. I'm going to be going over a lot of the teams here. And also, of course, as per usual, I will be releasing an LPL primer video, a playoff primer video, later on in the week, going into the weekend before playoffs start, to give a big overview of all of the teams in the playoffs. But at least for now, it's going to be a bit of a shorter video, and hopefully you guys are excited for that. But without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. Of course, if you are new here, what we do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and then at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Maybe not quite as prestigious as some of the other weeks because of how short it is, but still, player of the week is important. And of course, we will also be looking at the standings. I'm not going to be updating my power rankings in the same way as I have done for the rest of this year. I'm going to be taking a page out of what I've been doing for the rest of the regions in the final week and saving that for the playoff primer, so there's no spoilers on what I think might happen in my bracket, but we still are going to go over who ended up making playoffs and the matchups that could potentially come out of it. So, without further ado, let's jump right into week number 9, the final week of the regular season, and we kicked week number 9 off with a day 1 matchup between Team WE and Ultra Prime that WE is going to be able to take. Obviously, you would have hoped that they could come out here and dominate. They've not exactly been on the best of stretches. Recently, it feels like WE has, for lack of a better term, been figured out a bit. They put a lot of pressure topside. They really leave bot lane alone, and it doesn't necessarily play into the most consistent formula when you have other teams that know how to exploit that and have the talent to be able to go one-on-one with a lot of your players and to be able to just kind of outskill and out-mechanic your team as WE, which does bring some concerns for playoffs. However, Ultra Prime is not one of those teams. They don't have a particularly good game plan, and they certainly don't have the mechanics to be able to go toe-to-toe with other teams in the LPL. They are the worst team in the LPL, and they end off their split at 2-14 to kind of prove that. Really not great stuff from them. But for WE on the other side, again, it's just nice to pick up a win. It's nice to see that you can do it. It's nice to get that confidence and that momentum, at least rolling into the playoffs. Even if it's not the best of series, like, it would have been better if you had beaten, you know, other teams leading into this, you know, LNG or someone of that caliber last week. That would have been a lot better for WE, but still, a win is a win. You know, proving that you can win games is still important towards just kind of mentally being able to walk into those series. So, player of the series for me is going to go to Hang. This is kind of an important step, in my opinion, for WE, because Hang has been probably their biggest liability over the course of this split. That has definitely kind of turned into the bot lane in recent weeks. Prince and Awandi have negative chemistry together, and I'll talk about both of them in particular. The story is not really going to change for me from what I've been saying in recent weeks, but we will definitely get into it. But seeing Hang just come out, play Maokai, play Jax, and actually be able to generate early leads, be super useful in team fights, specifically on the Maokai in game number 1, it's great. Like, that's what you want to see. You want to see him be more consistent. The scouting report on Hang going into last year and coming out of last year was early game jungler that really likes to establish pressure, but does not know how to play from behind and really is not a good team fighter. So to see him pick things like Maokai and Jax and actively go into the second half of the game and be super relevant at just being in the right position and setting up plays for the rest of his team to capitalize on, that's really kind of the most encouraging thing you could see. Of course, the Jax was a little bit more of a carry pick, but still, it ended up working out, and I thought Hang played really well. Wayward, I thought, had a really nice bounce back series. He has not been the all-pro caliber player that he was at the beginning of the split. Like, through the first 4 or so weeks, because of the resources he was getting from this team, he was like an MVP candidate in terms of the production he was putting out, whether you wanted to consider him a top-tier top laner or not. I think that's generally a fair question. It's not like I would have ranked him as a top, 3 or 4 top laner at the time, but he was certainly producing like one because of the system that he was in. This was much more of that kind of performance rather than just kind of the average top lane performance we had been getting recently from him. Decade is certainly not the kind of player that's going to give you a lot of pushback. He's been the worst top laner in the entire league. I mean, he pulled out Camille in game number 1. Sorry, man, you're not that guy. But Wayward was solid here, and that's nice. Prince was really solid in this series, and that is also a really big positive. Him and Awandi have, again, negative chemistry in the bot lane. They just do not work well together. Prince has been super passive. He's lacked aggression in basically every sense of the word, but a lot of that is because he's constantly 1v2ing down in the bot lane because Awandi is roaming and playing out of lane, and that still happened a bit in game number 2 here on the Rakan, but I think it was at least a little bit better in this series. But I don't know, man, maybe I'm crazy. Awandi has just not been very good this year, and I've never been a big fan of Awandi. I've always been significantly lower on him and his playstyle, and maybe I'm biased again because I've always been lower on Awandi, and I've always talked about how I've been lower on Awandi, but I'm just not sold that he's an upper tier support or even like an upper half support in the LPL right now. I think he's a bigger reason why this bot lane is failing than Prince at the current moment. I think his mentality is just not there. But Fofo, good as a secondary carry. That's always been the role that he slotted into outside of that one, rare Adam year where it was just a little bit different. But WE is still a good team. I just don't know if they're going to be a great team. The scouting report has always been high floor, low ceiling, and I think that definitely translated here. And then for Ultra Prime, not a horrible series. There have been worse for them and worse for other teams throughout the year, but, I mean, it's indicative. They just can't win. They're not going to be competitive, and I would imagine that carries over into summer if they end up keeping this roster as 5. Dud of the series, unfortunately, is going to go to Hacker. I actually really like Hacker. I think he's been a lot better than people thought he was going to be this split. I've always been kind of more in on Hacker because I do think his early games are a bit better than people give him credit for, but he's certainly not a star by any means. He's just like a top 13 jungler in the LPL, which I think is better than the reputation he has, but Hang definitely out-jungled him here, and that's not really a particularly great sign. Decade is the single worst player in the LPL. I think I'm pretty confident in saying that at this point. The guy can't win against anybody to save his life, except for that one random series against Bin, which was very funny. Uakai is definitely the player on this team with actual potential, but they put him on Karma and Aurelion Sol, and really took him off of those assassins and those carry-oriented picks that he's comfortable on, and Doggo and Jway are just whatever. I still really like Jway, and I think moving forward, he can still be a very interesting support as a playmaker and a setup man on a better team, but it's just not going to matter. His style's too aggressive for a team that can't capitalize like this one can't, so not really shocked with how this turned out for Ultra Prime. It just kind of is what it is, and their season ends off in the same way that it's been, a little bit lackluster. And then for WE, going into playoffs, at least with the win at 500, it's what you want to see. There are going to be a lot of ties in terms of, tiebreakers down the stretch, depending on how these games end up working out. And WE is going to be in that cluster of like number 6 or 7 to number 10. A lot of those teams are basically in the same zone in terms of how good they are. WE having at least some momentum, some confidence going into the playoffs. Maybe that ends up pushing them over the top of some of those other teams. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and again, another series that is going to kind of determine how seeding ends up at the top of the playoffs. LGD Gaming taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and FPX does pick up the win. They move to 11-5, and so this creates a pretty interesting dynamic for the rest of this week. Obviously, we already knew that top Esports versus Ninjas in Pyjamas was going to matter a lot, but it is really going to matter a lot. FPX is really looking for a Ninjas in Pyjamas loss because with this win here, they put themselves at 11-5 and the potential to get a top 4 seed. If NIP can lose later this week to top Esports, then all of a sudden you're sitting there at the 4 seed. You're able to get around later in the playoffs, and that's a big positive, but Ninjas in Pyjamas obviously can still grab that 4 seed with a win later this week. But this is a nice win for FPX and, an inconsequential loss for Thunder Talk. They were already eliminated after the WE win earlier in the day, and so they didn't really have a ton to play for, but it is nice to see them actually try and go head-to-head with a team like FPX and honestly be relatively competitive in this series, and we'll talk about that in a second. But player of the series for me, it is going to go to Milky Way. This wasn't quite as obvious as some of the other series have been for FPX, where it's just been obvious that Milky Way is the best player on the team, but him playing Graves in both games 1 and 2 really kind of pushed it over the top. He carried game number 1 in terms of the damage he was able to output. Fantastic game. In game 2, he was the one that was keeping it close. The Karma, I think, really helped in that same vein. I thought Kara played really well in that that particular game, but Milky Way was the damage carry. He had all the resources, he had all the pressure on him. Unfortunately, they just couldn't quite get it over the top, but his Lee Sin in Game 3 was still very good, mostly a setup for the Ahri in the mid lane, but Milky Way continues to be the player that they run everything through on FPX. He really does deserve the hype right now. And typically speaking on rookies, I'm a little bit more hesitant to be like, this guy's amazing, this guy's dominating. You know, a lot of people, like, especially in the LPL, love to talk about upside, love to talk about the future, and love to project players as the next big thing. For the most part, I usually push back on those kinds of narratives, but Milky Way really is showing something special in terms of the performances he can put out. I know Beishuan and Thunder Talk aren't exactly the toughest of competitions, but he's been able to do this against some of the best in the entire league, and it's continuous, and it's impressive, and it's the fact that he can do it on both carries and facilitators. Now, is he going to be as consistent against the best teams in the world on things like Sejuani and Maokai? I just don't trust that yet. Like, he's not a perfect player, he's not clear-cut like a top 2 or 3 jungler in the league, but he's got all of the makings to be one of the most talented, if not the most talented jungler in the world. Very similar to, you know, what we were talking about with a player like Bo coming up many, many moons ago for FPX. But another player that I really want to give a shout out to who had an amazing series here was, of course, Care in the mid lane. I've been very critical of Care over the course of this split. I think Milky Way and Life have really been the big carries for FPX. They've been the big facilitators and the ones that are creating a lot of the plays for the team. Dekdom, I think, in recent weeks has really started to play better as well in the last, like, month or so. This bot lane has been a huge positive for FPX, but the solo laners have not. Care and Xiaolahu have just not been all that great. But when you look at the last 2 weeks, that's where Care has really started to get better. And if you start getting that development, if he can even get back to just what he was last year, which I thought was a pretty good mid laner for this team, then I think you're actually in a very dangerous spot, because it's clear that Milky Way does like to play through mid, and he does like to set up his mid laner to have some success. And if you can play something like Karma Graves, then all of a sudden Milky Way is now in a really good spot. Or you can set up the Ahri and have Care start to take over some of these mid-game skirmishes with really good positioning. You just open up more options and opportunities for how you want to play the game if you're FPX, and that's just generally going to make you harder to beat in a best of 5. I'm still worried about Xiaolahu because he did not play well in this series. He definitely kind of got outplayed by Hoya for the most part. That game 2 on the Jace was genuinely horrendous, but he has been good in the past. Maybe not great, but he's had a couple of weeks where he was solid last year, and, you know, there were weeks this year where he was solid as well. I don't think he's the biggest of liabilities in the entire league. I just don't think he's a strength, and I think the rest of this team is a strength. If there is a concern, it's that bot lane could regress back to the mean, especially if Rumble is going to consistently get banned out of Life's hands, but I do think Milky Way, and especially if Care steps up, that could be enough to push this team over into being super relevant regardless. And so for Thunder Talk, unfortunately, you're out of the playoffs. There's really not a lot to talk about here. This is how your split ends. I think maybe you would have hoped that UCal wouldn't get gapped in the final game so much on Hui, but he's done more than enough of the heavy lifting over the course of this split for me to give him at least a little bit of a pass. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Chocho in the support position. I think you could theoretically give this to Beishuan as well, but Beishuan, honestly, this wasn't even remotely close to his worst performance over the course of this split. He has been one of the worst players, or he's graded out, at least in terms of my metrics, as one of the worst players in the LPL, if not the worst player in the LPL. And while I do think that, you know, there are obviously things that we can't quantify in terms of communication and in terms of keeping the team on track that obviously lead to big reasons why he's still in the lineup, his mechanical performances have been so negative for the team that it's hard to really kind of justify that. But Chocho actually has been a positive. It just wasn't very positive in this series. His Renata just isn't particularly good. He's better on engagers. You want to see him on Nautilus. You want to see him on, you know, more aggressive picks that want to be playmakers. He's just not a Renata player. It's really not something that he's ever been particularly comfortable on, and I think we kind of saw that here. But generally for Thunder Talk, I think this split was kind of a major step back. As much as I still really like UCal, and I think he deserves a lot of the positive, you know, things that he's talked about, I don't think he had the same kind of split that he had in 2023. I think Hoya and Beishuan are two of the worst players in the entire league, and 1xN took a major step back from what he was in 2023 as well, in my opinion. And so there really are concerns here for Thunder Talk about whether or not this team could even be a playoff team with this construction of 5 in 2024. I think it's possible, especially because they started to get a little bit hotter down the stretch, but I still don't think this team is consistent in any sort of way. But for FPX, again, nice win. You're just kind of hoping for a Ninjas in Pyjamas loss at this point against top esports so that you can get that top 4 seed. If this organization, if this team ends up going into playoffs as one of the top 4 teams, that's going to be a major, major overachievement from what they were in the preseason. Then moving on now to day number 2 here in week number 9, and our middle day kicks off with a potential first round playoff preview here between Weibo Gaming and Invictus Gaming. that Weibo is going to be able to take. This is not a huge upset by any means. These two teams have been moving in these directions, respectively, with Weibo kind of getting a bit better, getting back up to 500, even if they certainly have not been the pinnacle of consistency, not that you would expect so from this organization, but Invictus, in their complete freefall, have fallen all the way down from a team that looked like they were going to get a top 4 or a top 5 seed in the LPL playoffs to a team that is barely scraping in, that could potentially even be the number 10 final team to make it in. So not great stuff coming in from Invictus. We'll talk about why I think they've started to fall off, and we'll also talk about why I'm really against this idea that Weibo and LNG and teams like that are just getting better. I don't think it's necessarily that. I want to make it clear, I think they're fine. Like, teams like LNG, I've gone on this rant in the past. If you followed the videos, you understand. I did a big one last week on LNG on why I think this conversation about them just fixing all of their problems is entirely overrated right now. Not to say that they haven't gotten better. I think Hong coming in has gotten better, but this isn't about LNG. A similar conversation can be made for Weibo, where it's like, okay, great, you're taking advantage of the bad teams and the ones that are playing super inconsistent right now, but you're still losing all of the games that you would be expecting to win if you were actually a good team. And that doesn't mean that you're a good team, right? Just because you're beating Invictus Gaming, who's in freefall mode, that doesn't change my mind. That quote-unquote win streak doesn't mean as much to me, right? Like, same thing for LNG, where they've won, what, like 5-6 series in a row, but like all of them are against like Ultra Prime and Edward Gaming and RNG and, Rare Atom, and it's like, okay, great, like you beat the bad teams. That doesn't really like change my perception of you all that much, because I still don't think you're going to be a contender. That's something we're going to have to find out in playoffs. But for Weibo, their problems definitely still exist. We even saw some of the inconsistency in this series. However, it just didn't matter. The mechanical difference between these two teams was massive. Player of the series for me was kind of tough, but I'm going to give it to ZDZ in the top lane. I felt like his game 1 on the Quinn was so fun to watch that he deserved to be considered player of the series here. I think Xiao Hao was probably more consistent. Out of the jungle, I think Leon has really struggled in the last couple of weeks in terms of actually being able to generate pressure in the same kind of way that he has recently. His kind of early season buff has worn off, if you will, with them picking him up mid-season, but I think ZDZ was exceptional in that first game, and when it's just a weird situation, I don't think I would have him in. As much as You Should Know Me had been struggling before being benched, at least he gives you the kind of upside that you would hope for. Like, at least if things end up going really bad for the rest of your team, you have the idea or the hope that he could just mechanically outplay his opponent because he is so good on that side of the rift, even if he makes bad decisions, even if he's not necessarily perfect within structure. At least you have that option. Wen just doesn't give you that. The guy picked Gangplank in game number 2 in this meta on 14-5 or whatever we're on. What are we doing? Like, Gangplank's horrible. Like, this champion just doesn't do anything in the game right now. You picked it with Nidalee. Gangplank, Nidalee, Senna? I don't get this draft in game 2. I think it's super weak, but ZDZ took advantage of that. He was also very good in game 1, but like I said, Xiao Hao was also great. In particular, I think that Volibear game. In game 2, he was just everywhere on the map. Leon was supposed to have the early game pressure because he picked Nidalee. Just didn't end up working out that way. Xiao Hao was better. Xiao Hu was good. Light was very good at capitalizing on the pressure. Crisp really didn't make any major mistakes. Weibo looked good in this series. They certainly weren't as aggressive and proactive as maybe they would have been last year in situations and circumstances like this, but I still think this is a team that you're going to have to look out for going into the playoffs. They're not going to be an easy beat for anybody. And then for IG, they are kind of worrying me. I think this has kind of turned into a trend with these players, which is why it's starting to become something that I'm actually genuinely concerned about. They just are figured out. Like, the problem with IG has been they're really good when they can just kind of be first in the meta to something. Last year it was You Should Know Me, doing all these weird invades at like 2 minutes in the top lane and taking out the enemy jungler and then using those resources to dominate the top side of the map. And then, they would eventually get caught doing that and fall off. This year it was Leon just playing super aggro, going for level 3 ganks every game. And again, teams just kind of caught on, and eventually that style has ended up being less effective. It really does feel like IG relies a bit more on gimmicks than other teams do to be relevant. And that's a bit of a problem for a team that's going into a best of 5. Like, gimmicks do not work in best of 5s because you're just not going to get them all that consistently. And so I really don't feel great about IG. Wink is going to get dead of the series here because I thought his engages on Alistar were miserable in game 1, and he did nothing on the Maokai in game 2, but there were so many more egregious members in terms of draft in game 2. I really hate Gangplank Nidalee. I think that is one of the strangest things that you could have possibly drafted here. I get it's probably comfort for Wen. I imagine he plays a lot of GP, but it's just not a good pick in the meta right now. And Leon is really not playing Nidalee well, even if game 1 was okay. Theoretically, you did a lot of heavy lifting, with the Quinn in the top lane. So, Cryan, I think, has really fallen off from being a pretty big carry for this team at the beginning of the split. He's not getting the same kind of resources, especially ever since Leon came in, who is a bit more resource heavy as a jungler. And On, I think, is fine, but really not like game breaking. And I like Wink as a player, but he's not playing particularly well. I just don't have a lot of faith in IG. They are kind of returning to normalcy here, being one of the less interesting teams going into the playoffs. I honestly would be shocked in their current form if they ended up winning a playoff series in round 1. But for Weibo, this is a good sign that they at the very least are better than IG. This is very likely going to be their first round matchup coming out here of week number 1. In fact, it might be locked in after this. I think all of the 8-8 teams are now locked in. There's 4 8-8 teams. I think Weibo is the best of those records and Invictus has the worst of those records. And so maybe a preview for round number 1. If that's the case, Weibo's definitely going to be excited about that because what they just proved here was that they are clearly the better of these two teams. And now taking a bit of a break from the games that actually matter for playoff qualification, 2 non-playoff teams going head-to-head. LGD Gaming taking on RNG. And LGD is going to pick up a win, and that means they end their split at 6-10. Congratulations to this team, to this org. This is way better than I and a lot of other people expected from them over the course of this split. They were genuinely one of the best non-playoff teams in the entire league, and I think that is a pretty clear overperformance from just what these players should be accomplishing as a unit. There are not a lot of super talented players on this team. Bot lane is certainly not one of the better ones in the entire league, but we've gotten some major overperformances from some players that have stepped up and started to develop. And, you know, on the flip side of that, RNG on the other side have majorly underperformed. If you would have told me at the beginning of the split that RNG would be worse than LGD Gaming by a pretty clear amount, like pretty clearly worse, I would be stunned. I would not have believed you, but here we are. LGD was clearly better than RNG for this split. Better record, and they beat them. And they looked better in a lot of those games. It's pretty great for LGD. Player of the series for me is going to go to Haichao in the mid lane. He really is the player that I think has emerged for LGD. Like I've talked about all year, I was not somebody that believed in Haichao. I thought he was just going to be, you know, another one of these players that continuously gets jobs on lower teams because continuity reasons, right? He's a talented player, but not necessarily a star. Think someone like Karis over in the LCK, where it's like, yeah, he keeps getting jobs, but it's mostly because he's played at this level before and not because of this theoretical upside. But Haichao actually did break out in 2024, which I certainly did not see coming. Really good split from him. I think the more supportive meta actually helps out his playstyle a bit. Things like Karma, I think, really fit into how he likes to play the game. And I think he actually did a great job of making the rest of his team look stronger because of it. Meteor, I think, was better down the stretch. They started to actually play into the things that he was good at. He was kind of struggling a lot for most of this split. He certainly was worse in this split than he was in summer of last year, in my opinion. But now he gets to play Graves and Kindred, and all of a sudden he's looking better again. Big shocker that he looks better on the champions he's good at than the Sejuani and the Maokai that he's not quite as good at. But I still like Bertle. I'm still hanging on. I know that there are a lot of people that have just given up on him, but he might not be the most consistent top laner in the world. He's going to give you at least like 6 to 7 good games a year, and you'll take that for a bottom tier team that's better than a lot of other, you know, teams will get. And then Xiaoya, I think, has also kind of really developed towards the back half here. They put him in for Kepler because Kepler was miserable, and Xiaoya was also really bad at the start of their tenure, but the more he got comfortable, I think playing specifically off of Meteor and Jin Zhao as well, but, you know, playing off of the macro decisions that this team wanted to make, I think he really settled into his role. A lot of AD carries around the league kind of have done this, where they really struggled at the beginning of the split and started to really feel a lot better. It hasn't always been the case. We'll talk about the other side of the coin later on in this when we talk about LWX, but Xiaoya, I think, did show some interesting things. I think this could potentially be a team that continues to grow and maybe makes playoffs moving into summer. I'm not saying that that's definitely going to happen. I could also see a world in which things come crashing back down and they end up being a bottom 3 team in summer because this was an overperformance while the rest of the teams at the bottom started to tried to figure out what they wanted to do, because those teams are more talented. A team like RNG is more talented than LGD, but they just play better as a unit, and that was clear here. And then for RNG on the other side, they just don't have any sort of consistency or synergy together as a unit. You can talk about the things that are going right or wrong, but it doesn't really matter when, as a group of 5, they are worse than their individual skill levels, which is never ideal. Dud of the series is going to go to LWX. I'm not really going to sit here and brag about it, but this really was one of my best takes of the entire offseason, that LWX was majorly overrated. I had him, I think, at number 13 in my 80 carry rankings going into the year, and man, I got a lot of hate comments. Like, man, oh man, did I receive a lot of comments like, you're crazy, LWX is a top 5 ADC. I feel pretty vindicated. I feel pretty justified. He has been one of the worst players in the LPL. Maybe you can look at the series and not dislike his gameplay as much as I did, but his positioning on Jinx was genuinely game-losing. In game number 2, they had a potential to be able to fight here, and it just didn't work out. Ming has also been one of the worst supports in the LPL. You could actually make an argument he's been like bottom 4 in terms of performances, and that's really not what people expected. I was high on Ming. I thought if this bot lane was going to be good, it was going to be because Ming was such a stabilizing presence that LWX had so many resources that he couldn't wouldn't mess it up, that his positioning and his bad, just mechanics over the past couple of years really weren't going to be a problem because of the opportunity that he would have had on this team, but the opportunity was not there either, and so this bot lane genuinely just ended up being one of the bottom 3 bot lanes in the LPL, which was certainly not expected even from a hater like me. Tong Yuan is just not good enough to play at this level. He was fine in this series, didn't really make mistakes, but when Haichao's coming out and being more aggressive and creating more plays and being more of a playmaker, that's like the opposite of what you want to see in a situation like this. Wei, I think, has played better recently, but he's still not a star, and certainly somebody that I'm lower on. And I still like Breathe. I think on a better team, he would be a lot more highly regarded, but this is not a better team. This is a bad RNG team, and I don't really see a lot of reason for it to turn around. I think changes are definitely possible mid-season. I don't know what they would look like. I don't know where you would go. Mid lane and bot lane are the 2 first roles that obviously that pop into my mind. I think Wei is probably here until Milky Way comes back from loan, and then Breathe, I think also is probably staying, or at least I would keep him. You're probably not going to find an upgrade in that top lane, but there are mid laners and bot laners out there that are available that I think you could give a call that would be interested in this job, that can make your team instantly better. And I think that's definitely the direction I would expect RNG to go in. But for LGD, again, nice win. Do I think they can translate this momentum into summer? I hope so, because they're really fun to watch in their current state, but it's just hard to believe that this roster, who's overperforming so much right now, is going to be able to keep that up. But at least for now, like, spring was such a good split for them in terms of expectation. And then moving on to our final day of action in the regular season here in the spring split, we kicked it off with a matchup between Rare Atom and LNG Esports that LNG is going to pick up a win in. They end out their regular season, I should say, on a win streak, a pretty massive one. And while I'm not nearly as convinced that they are definitely going to be this gigantic dominant playoff team, I do think they are better than we thought they were at the beginning of the year. I think the insertion of Hong into the lineup in the support position has really helped. Obviously, a lot of people are pointing to the new coaching staff as a big reason why things have started to go well. I have more so pointed to, they're better than teams like Rare Atom. They're better than teams like LGD Gaming. They're better than teams like RNG. And they always were. Like, when they faced this really tough run of games at the start of the season and went 2-6, that was kind of an expected record. Perhaps you were frustrated by the loss to Thunder Talk, but outside of that, basically every series went as expected outside of that. So 2-6 really wasn't all that shocking for me. We all knew that they were going to go on this big win streak down the stretch of the regular season because of the way their schedule ended up working out, and that's exactly what they did. And so, perception-wise, they're really not all that different to me from what they were in the first half, but obviously, in general, it's nice to see them actually go out there and win the games. It's nice in theory to say that you're better than the bottom teams, but we've seen teams like EDG and RNG that were supposed to be that, not be that. So it's nice to see LNG actually go out and be better than the bottom teams. For Rare Atom, very disappointing split. You obviously expected a lot more after doing so well in the Demacia Cup, but there's a lot to work on for this team, and they are trying to make changes. They're trying out new configurations of the lineup. None of them have really stuck, and none of them have really worked, so we'll talk about that. But for LNG, the big winner for me in this series was actually Gala, my player of the series. I know a lot of people are going to point to Scout as the player that's really been emerging and re-breaking out here. Obviously, I think the direction of how this team has wanted to play has really played into Scout's preferences and his playstyle a bit more. In the beginning of the split, Weibo was getting a lot of the resources in the jungle, and they were kind of playing that Weibo gaming style of wanting to skirmish a lot from 10 to 15 minutes over objectives, and that's just not something that LNG did all that much last year, and it's certainly not something that I think Scout is all that comfortable with. It's just not a style that I think he plays at a super high level. He's not like a Talia player that wants to shove and try and, move around with his jungler and skirmish around these void grubs every single game. He wants to get to these front-to-back team fights. He wants these games to go a bit longer. He doesn't really want a ton of action in the early game. And I think as soon as this team started playing more into that style, things started working out a bit better. I think Weiwei has looked worse because of it, because it's not his style, but you will happily take that because Scout, quite frankly, is just significantly more important towards this team's success than Weiwei is. But honestly, I feel like because of all that conversation, Gala has flown under the radar with just how good and important he's been for LNG. He has been the rock for this team over the course of this split. I'm pretty high on Gala, not necessarily. I've always said that, Gala's the one player in the world that I feel like I'm right on the money with public perception on. People have always consistently talked about him as a top 5 AD carry in the world, but maybe not like top 1 or top 2, like he's never really been in that conversation, and I agree with that. He is one of the most talented AD carries in the world, but mentality-wise, he's just not this like game breaker that you're going to get with the best AD carries in the world. He's consistently going to be great because he is so good at the game, but he's not really going to be on the same level as like a ruler in terms of the way that he plays mid games, and you kind of got that here. His team fighting is still excellent. I mean, the Jinx was so important at the end of game 3. He almost pulled back game number 1 with how strong he was on Jinx, and this champion continues to overperform, I think, a lot of people's metrics, and I agree the Jinx is very strong, but Gala plays it at a super high level. Of course, having a player like Scout, who was so good on Ahri in game 3, definitely helps. Having a player like Zika, who was so good on Renekton throughout a majority of this series, I think definitely helps. There were just a lot of positives to take away, but Gala, to me, is definitely the standout in terms of a lot of the positive traits that I'm taking away from a series like this. I think Weiwei has gotten a little bit more consistent in this role. Bel'Veth, Lee Sin, these are things that don't necessarily need to do a ton in the early game in order to be relevant. Well, Lee Sin, not so much. Lee Sin definitely wants to do a ton in the early game, but you know, Weiwei's really good at the champion. He can still do a lot on Lee in the late game, and, you know, we see Scout playing a lot less, I don't want to say less proactive, but playing more his style, playing more of the front to back, less of this skirmish style, and I think it's really helping them out a lot. Hong, obviously, I think has also made the team better. He is awesome as a support, arguably top 3 in the entire league in terms of how good he is, but LNG is finding their groove. Do I think it's going to be able to last against the best teams in the region? I still don't know. Like, do I think they're better than Ninjas in Pyjamas? Do I think they're better than FunPlus Phoenix? I don't have the answers to those questions, but at least for now, it's nice to see them go on a win streak. And then for Rare Atom, you know, they're not good, and it's sad that they're not good. I think it's honestly more sad with them than it is for a lot of other teams. They're kind of in that RNG spectrum of, like, we really expected this team to do better than what they did, and there were a lot of problems, a lot of things you could point to as to why things ended up going wrong, but you go for a new support in this one. Xiaoxi comes back in here. He played one series earlier in the year, and he was awful there. He played another series here, and he was awful here, which is really sad, because I thought he was great last year in the PCS. He was one of the more interesting, if not the single most interesting player coming out of the PCS last year, was great at Worlds, and I was really shocked that they started Zora over him. Zora has been really bad, so they keep trying to see if they want to go to Xiaoxi, but clearly that's not going to work either. He's going to get dead of the series here. Just not a particularly good series when you're an engager and you're constantly getting caught out. Like, it's a very Hylissang, in a negative way-esque performance coming in here from Xiaoxi, and you're going to get that every once in a while, but the rest of this team wasn't good either. Assume is just someone I'm super low on. I've never seen the hype. Like, I've just never seen the reason why I should get excited about him as a future AD carry star. It's the same thing, like, there's so many LPL AD carries that come in, have a couple of good games, and then all of a sudden the community is anointing them as the next big thing in that role. 1xN was kind of that for Thunder Talk. I think both of those guys are fine. They're not necessarily awful, like, mechanically, but they certainly weren't ever players that I expected to break out and become superstars. It just didn't feel like it was ever in the cards for them, and Assume has kind of, you know, taken that role. I think Vikla was certainly better over the second half of the split than he was over the first half, but that first half was so bad that that's the part that people are going to remember, even if he did play better. Nayu actually was significantly better in the final 2 weeks of the season, but those were really the only good weeks that he had, and for a player that was so highly touted, you're just kind of sad to see him come into the league and be essentially a non-factor. And Xiaoshu is definitely still the best player on this team. It just doesn't really matter at the end of the day. There's only so much you can do from the top side of the map. RA is just kind of an aimless team. I expect changes to be made. Bot lane would be the first place that I would look. I know people want to see, like, Vikla get replaced because he's an import and, you know, he's got this reputation from his time in North America, but I think he's shown enough down the stretch that if you got better talent around him, I actually think he could still be a positive for you, even if he wasn't in this split. The bot lane, though, I just don't ever see a circumstance in which they are ever even league average, and so I would imagine that would be the direction I would go if you do look to make changes, but, you know, we'll see what ends up happening for Rare Atom in the offseason here. But for LNG, you know, they are on a streak. I don't know how much I trust it. I don't know how much I believe it, but at the very least, they've shown that they can win games. And ending the season at 9-7 really isn't all that bad, considering you started at 2-6. And so, you know, a really nice end to the split. We'll see if it carries over into playoffs. And then moving on to our final series of the regular season here in 2024 spring in the LPL, and it's one that actually matters. This determines a lot. Not only does this determine who's going to get the number 4 seed, this determines who's going to get the number 2 seed as well. So a big series. It's Top Esports taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas. And Top Esports is going to pick up the win. They're going to 2-0 NIP, although it was a lot closer than 2-0 would suggest. I think both of these games were very winnable for NIP, but TES able to close them out, able to come out on top in both, and that means that first of all, Top Esports with this win gets the 2 seed, which means that they are one of the top 2 seeds. They automatically gain entry into the double elimination part of the bracket. They are one of only 2 teams, obviously, to do that, which is big. They get that 2 seed over LGD Gaming, which I don't think a lot of people expected going into the year, but congratulations to them. And because of this, NIP gets the 5 seed, which means that they have an extra round to end up playing, but also it means FPX, FunPlus Phoenix, gets the 4 seed, which means that they don't have an extra round to play. So this series actually did have a lot of, ripple effects, if you will, on how the playoff seeding ended up going. But congratulations to Top Esports. They deserved this win because they had the best player in the series, and that was 369 in the top lane. Rolling all nines today, that is absolutely for sure. The dude has been dominant, in my opinion, pretty clearly the best top laner in the LPL so far in 2024. He has just been absolutely destructive in terms of how he has played a lot of these games. Shanji has certainly not lived up to the hype coming over here to NIP. He has played worse than he did on OMG, but he's still a good player, and he's certainly still a good laner. But man, it did not matter with 369 coming in and dominating this matchup. Really, really impressive stuff. There's just not a lot else to say. Tion tried his best to throw away some of these games. Jackie Love had his real first bad game of the year here in game 2 on the Senna. His positioning was just way too aggressive. A pretty traditional Jackie Love bad game. It happens every once in a while. He hasn't really had a lot of these over the past year or so, and so it was kind of jarring to end up seeing that. Fodic was just straight up better in this one, but 369 was good enough to be able to bail both of them out. He was insta-winning team fights, completely 1v9ing this game, and it was really impressive to see. I do want to give a shout out to Mako as well. I really hate Senna Ornn. I really hate Senna Ornn. I think it's really bad. I think it is very clear that it makes the Senna worse in almost every single conceivable way, and we've seen that basically every single time it's been picked in pro play, but Mako played the Ornn really well, so at least there's that. At least you're sacrificing the Senna in order to make the Ornn a little bit better. I don't like that idea, but at least, Mako got something out of it. He was really good on the Ornn in a lot of these team fights, so there's that. Cream certainly wasn't a problem. Putting him on Karma, he's definitely adapted and evolved a lot better as this more facilitative mid, somebody who, going up against his former teammates here in Shanji and Aki, his former big, running mates that he played with for so many years, him playing 2 games of Karma, being willing to take a backseat and actually still playing well. I've honestly been pretty impressed by Cream over the course of this split, not because he's been actively carrying games, but because he hasn't been carrying games, because he's been a secondary carry, because he's been playing more facilitators, which is not really something that you would necessarily know Cream for as a player. So credit to him, but 369 really was the guy for Top Esports, and without him, they would not have won this series. And then for NIP on the other side, obviously, you would have liked to win this. You would have liked to get one of those top 4 seeds, but you were not favorites in this series, and I'm still high on this team. I know people have started to just give up on them because teams like Weibo and LNG have started going on hotter streaks, and a team like NIP has had kind of the opposite schedule where they got a lot of their easier teams at the beginning of the year, and they've really struggled to beat the best teams in the league in the back half, but I still believe in NIP a lot. I think I still trust them more than a lot of other analysts do, and just because they didn't win this series doesn't mean there weren't a lot of encouraging signs. Aki was phenomenal here. He was definitely the better jungler out of these two. This is maybe the best series that he has played all year long, and that is super encouraging because he's been kind of a disappointment for this team. Both of the OMG boys coming over here have been kind of a disappointment. Unfortunately, one of those did stick here. Shanji is going to get done of the series, just mega gapped by 369 in and out of lane across this entire series. I think if he had been just a bit more responsive, if he had been able to keep up, I think NIP actually walks away with a win in this series. Maybe not in the series. We don't know what happens in game 3, but at least they walk away with the game 2 win. I don't think they lose game 2 if that Rek'Sai is not as bad as it is, if 369 is not able to take over as much as he's able to on the Renekton in game number 2. So definitely not ideal for Shanji, but you gotta imagine he's gonna be better at some point. The mechanics are just too good. Unfortunately, it's really not been his year, but Rookie and Fodic continue to look great. I think Fodic in particular is just awesome right now. It's crazy how I've just turned 180 on him. I hope this is an example that I'm really not afraid to change my opinions. I'm really not afraid to admit when I'm wrong about something, because 2022 I was super low on Fodic. I turned out to be right on that. 2023 I was very low on Fodic. I thought he was genuinely, metric-wise, in terms of my metrics, he graded out as the worst player in the LPL. I don't know if I would go that far, but he certainly was close to that. He was awful last year, but you put him back with Rookie, you give him some confidence, and you let him kind of just do his own thing without kind of expecting too much from him on a team that didn't have a lot of other win conditions, and all of a sudden now he's a lot better again. He actually can win, and this is the best split of his career, in my opinion. I'm really impressed with the way he's playing the game right now, but Rookie, I think, is a big part of that, and Juo's also fine. He's a league average support. He's not this below league average support that everybody said he was going into the year, and so I think NIP is an interesting team. I think they're going to be better than people expect them to be in the playoffs, and I would not expect them to be an easy out. However, I certainly don't think it's going to be an easy path into top 4 for them. But for Top Esports, really nice win. Getting that top 2 seed is obviously super important to get yourself in the best possible position going into the playoffs, but it's all really about what you do there. Top Esports as an org is kind of known for underperforming in big moments. Just because you got that top 2 seed doesn't mean you're going to earn it. There's still a lot of question marks about whether or not this team can be a finals team. At least in this series, they proved a little bit of that to me. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week number 9 overview and analysis video. That is the end of the LPL Spring Split regular season. Up on the screen, the final standings here. After 9 weeks of action, after the regular season, we have our playoff teams. Of course, no power rankings for the playoff teams because we are going to be releasing a playoff primer video where I go in depth on all of these teams later on in the week, and I also give a full bracket prediction, so I don't want to spoil that too much by telling you guys who I'm high on and who I'm low on going into that video already. You can maybe get an idea from how I talked about some of these teams, but I will talk about the bottom teams, the non-playoff teams in terms of their power rankings. The only change is LGD jumping up to 11. They are the best non-playoff team right now, and I think that has become abundantly clear. AL falling to 12, Thunder talked to 13, RNG to 14. They are clearly worse than LGD. This is just the best team to not make the playoffs, whether or not their record ends up showing that, but not really a lot to talk about outside of that. I'm very interested to see what happens. I think the matchups we got in terms of the playoffs are very interesting. In round 1, Weibo and Invictus Gaming, OMG and WE, these are very intriguing matchups that I think will create some very interesting opportunities for the rest of the playoffs, but I would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on where everybody landed down in the comment section below. Do you think that, any teams are over or under seeded in terms of how they performed, that they might over or underperform their rankings? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions, and of course, you'll see mine later in the week, but time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 9. Player of the week is going to go to 369. Not always the easiest to determine these player and duds of the week when you have so little games to go off of, but 369's performance this week was the most impressive to me. He literally 1v9'd in a super important game for his team, so this was a pretty obvious player of the week for me. He has been the best top laner in the LPL so far this year, and continuing on with that, it's just really, really fun to watch. The runners-up, Milky Way, jungler for FPX, great series from him. Really happy to see him start to take over on things like Graves. That's kind of the LPL special, so really nice to see that aggressiveness come out. And Hang, who had maybe the best split, or maybe the best series of the split up until this point. He has been a bit of a disaster for WE. It's nice to see him start to gain some confidence going into the playoffs, but dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to stay in the 369 game. It's going to go to Shanji, the top laner for NIP. He's just not really clicked with this org, with this team. There were so many expectations on them because Shanji was such a good player, because these solo laners were supposedly supposed to be so good, and Shanji's just not lived up to the billing so far. He got destroyed, and he's kind of the reason his team lost that second game, which is definitely a little disappointing. If he can get back on track, I think NIP could still be one of the scarier teams in the entire league because of the way Rookie and Fodic in particular are playing right now, but there's really not a lot of confidence that that is definitely going to happen. There is real concern that he is just going to be this. So, dud of the week in week 9 is Shanji, player of the week is 369, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed my coverage of the entire regular season. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below, and leave a like on this video. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you are new here, hit subscribe. We're going to be covering, of course, the playoffs here in the LPL every single round on this channel. We're going to be doing a primer, and then, of course, going through series by series when those do start happening. We've got the LCK playoffs going. We've got LEC playoffs coming up. We've got LCS playoffs, like, in the middle, NACL playoffs in the middle right now. There's so much going on in the world of LoL Esports, and MSI is also just around the corner. If you want analysis on all of the teams that have the potential to go there, and then eventually analysis on MSI, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all